Hi there, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. In just a second, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Lillian, Will, and Owen. Slightly different than our usual deal for this one. We recorded this episode during a Twitch live stream a few days ago. Huge thanks to everyone who joined us for the stream and participated in the chat. We all had a really great time. The episode's only very lightly edited compared with our normal stuff, both to retain a bit more of the naturalistic live show vibe and also because I'm lazy, just really lazy. Feel free to let us know what you think, and if you like it, maybe we'll do more live stream recordings in the future. With all that said, let's start the show.
Hi everyone, welcome to the stream. So we're talking about a paper that is forthcoming. I don't remember where it's forthcoming. Can you remind me, Will?
Puncta. It's called Puncta.
So the title of the paper is called Crisis Consciousness, Utopian Consciousness, and the Struggle for Racial Justice. And when I read this paper, I thought it was an extremely timely, and Will is, at least my understanding of things, is diagnosing a kind of, I want to say mainstream, but I also just think ubiquitous way of thinking about social change. And he calls it the awareness model of consciousness, wherein people, if you raise awareness or you raise consciousness about a particular social issue, then like somehow social change is supposed to come from that. And I think that we're kind of aware of that model when it comes to like really liberal politics, like in school. It's like raise awareness about the earth and like Earth Day, and then like what do we, we raise awareness about issues. It's what you do when you engage in advocacy or lobbying and what have you. And so there's this way of thinking about social change and the role that consciousness is supposed to play in it. And it's also the case that like we tend to think about this way of integrating consciousness into social change when we talk about racial justice, whether implicitly or explicitly. We think that, for example, white people becoming increasingly aware of racism should like do something in general. Like we just think something should happen after that. And one of the big social questions of the post-2020 era is, insofar as we're 2 years out from the most, largest in-the-street protests, some say in American history, against, police brutality, and in the specific instance of George Floyd's murder, you saw this huge shift in consciousness and a multiracial group of people on the streets. People, and it's kind of shocking the speed and the intensity of the discussion about what we call our racial reckoning or the Great Awakening or whatever else you want to call it since 2020. But the uncomfortable question that should be confronting us all, that Will takes up in the paper, is like, well, why didn't change happen after that? Like, if it's true, we can talk about change in small ways, like, and I think that people can get a little bit anxious when you say nothing happened, because it's like, what was all that for? And then you can talk about taking down statues, and you can talk about various efforts for diversifying and various attempts to defund the police. But like, I think the meta picture here is that, like, structurally speaking, we're all kind of like burying our head in the sands if you think like the big change went on, or that it's obviously coming. And I feel like what Will is doing is confronting this reality in a really, in a theoretical way, and is saying like, what is it why didn't it happen? Is it simply, and here's the prevailing theories in the New York Times, for example, is it that there's just still too much ignorance, despite the fact that every corner of our society is talking about race? Is it the case that people are not true in their anti-racist conversions, like it's just not serious enough? Or is it the case that like there is just a massive backlash of consciousness, like that people can be kind of won over momentarily, but then there is just backlash after that, almost inevitably for reasons that are unclear? And so all of this prompts Will to ask what role social consciousness plays in social transformation. Like, what do we expect about shifts in consciousness? And what I understand Will to be doing is giving a materialist theory of consciousness, and he, at various points in the paper, contrasts a materialist theory of consciousness with, implicitly, I think, an idealist one, in which the materialist theory of consciousness has a couple of levels that the idealist one doesn't. The idealist one would say that awareness and cognition are basically the stuff of human consciousness, and therefore we would just expect stuff to happen once you are thinking about things or are aware of things. Whereas like the materialist theory of consciousness has a couple of levels. On the one hand, there's two questions. It's like, yes, being aware of problems is one thing, but then the additional question is like, given that I am aware, now what do I do? These are two, and I think that's how you put it in the paper. And the fact that the idealist version of consciousness doesn't ask about this second level means that there's kind of like an epistemic deficiency in the way that we think about the role of consciousness in social transformation. So that's just kind of like, there's a taking stock moment in this paper that I think is super interesting and politically relevant. And the second is the kind of juxtaposition of two different materialist and idealist ways of thinking about consciousness. And then the third thing is like what a comparison between different kinds of consciousness, crisis and utopian consciousness. And Will basically argues that the crisis consciousness is kind of what we're all aware of, like you become aware of a problem, but it's not clear that there's like a political follow-through to that. And what seems to be missing, and this is a part of Will's bigger project, is the utopian consciousness, which is our ability to anticipate the future, our ability to turn, a crisis into something that opens up a world or opens up horizons for us. And that seems to be like the forgotten level of analysis, that we just demand that people know more. And now we have just a world of people who like know everything. Like within the past 5 years, people have become experts on racism in the United States in this fascinating way, but like are politically just in terms of practical knowledge, it's not clear that those two things are happening simultaneously. So that's what I would say are like the three things: taking stock, the role of consciousness in social transformation, and like what a materialist idea of this is. And then the payoff of this is like, you need to be able to construct realistic utopias about the future if you want consciousness to play a role in like social change. So I am sorry that went on a long time. I just kind of okay.
That was great.
So I'm just going to ask Will, and then I'm going to shut up and everybody else can jump in. I just thought maybe a summary for live listeners would be helpful.
Yeah.
Who is the audience for this, and what was your motivation in constructing the paper? Because when I read it, I was like, there's kind of an obvious audience, which is the people who tell you to recycle and raise awareness about Earth Day and think about racial justice similarly. But
the Earth Day's killing me. Like, how well has that worked out for us?
But I also think there's like a more subtle, deeper audience that is much broader than that among liberals, progressives on the left. So I wanted to just invite you to say what got you into this, who is it for, and why did you write it now?
Yeah, thank you. So the audience, you're right. The audience is the obvious people who are just like, like read Robin DiAngelo, that will do it. Put on Kenti scars, that'll do it. And so that's kind of low-hanging fruit. But my deeper audience is actually, other philosophers, especially philosophers on the left who are maybe closer to a more liberal way of thinking. And I'm trying to unearth that I think in philosophies that deal with epistemologies of ignorance, that focus, a great deal on ideology critique, that this is, sort of unsaid premise. That, the problem with social change is that, people are still confused, that, people still harbor these reactionary desires. And, I'm looking at like the George Floyd protest, and I think it's just not feasible anymore to say that, people don't know, that they're not aware. And I understand that, what I think is at the center of this, and what I'm trying to challenge in a deeper way, is that we have a hard time thinking of what agency means when we are constrained by social orders. And so we think the way out of that is, consciousness can have this voluntaristic capacity that once it knows, it can just, do. Once it knows about an injustice, it can do something about it. Well, what I'm trying to understand is, can we give give a richer account of why it can seem like a social order is about to change and why the change does not appear. And I cash this out with this phrase, horizons of normative expectations. And I try to understand that consciousness isn't just a work of awareness, being cognitively aware of things. It's also the work of prediction. It's a work of analyzing one's environment so that you can have some sort of coherent relationship with your surroundings. And people don't do very well when you upset those predictions. And so this is also me pushing against the idea that you're not going to get the social change you want by trying to convince people just take a leap of faith or something. And so what I'm trying to argue at the end of the day, what I'm calling utopian consciousness, and I can talk more with you all about it, is that we need to develop counter institutions that can develop knowledge not just of how the world works, but what latencies or possibilities inhere in our form of life. If we can accept the idea that consciousness, the way that I put in the paper, it can't just outstrip social order. It cannot just leap into another form of life. Then we need to start asking, well, what can consciousness do when it's trying to pay attention not just to the constraints, but what may be latent possibilities in the scenario. And so I'll shut up after I say this last thing that I think is really important for me. And this is the impression that Gill and his spinicisms left on me. Utopian consciousness for me is not cashed out in the imagination. We have all sorts of imaginations about the type of life we could live. It's all sorts of visions, a world without police, a world without borders, a world without nation states, et cetera, et cetera. But I can imagine a world where the skies may have cotton candy. That doesn't tell me if that's actually a practical reality. What I want to say is that utopian consciousness is about knowledge generation. It is about actually understanding not just one's social order, but real objective possibilities in that social order. That I think that this might be a bit frustrating to some because it also means not everything is possible at every moment. But what we can do is start creating the types of knowledge institutions that can be prepared when a crisis emerges, when there's a breakdown, and we can start constructing something new.
I mean, it seems to me that then just to stick with the, who's the object of the critique here and who's the audience in a certain way, that in a certain way, I took this to be as it were, critique of critique. I took the very practice of critique to be one of the things that was at issue. So, you have on the one hand, the simple awareness model, right? Which is the wearing kente cloth and reading Robin DiAngelo or something, right? But then you have a more, I guess, apparently complex awareness model, which is that, well, if I just write the best book about what the history of prisons are in the US, and it tells us everything, and it really distills the logic of incarceration and carcerality, then that critical enterprise in itself has some obvious, not something that doesn't need to be translated or interpreted, some obvious connection to what we should do about it, or how is something ever going to be done about it? You know what I mean? So that was, for me at least, that's what I took, at least an implicit, whether you intended it or not, a kind of implicit target of what you were doing was a certain model of critique predicated on awareness raising, whether it admits it or not.
Yeah, I like that. I hadn't quite thought of it as a critique of critique, but I mean, let me be clear. I think the deeper substance of my worry here is that this reliance on what I'm calling the awareness model, this for either a simplistic model of critique or even more complex, it often gets cashed out as if what we need are bureaucracies to absorb this, and then just tell people these things. And that's why we have all of these either cringe or, dangerous things of people losing their jobs because they aren't woke enough. And I'm looking at this, and Lily wants to know where my heart was when writing this. And I'm just enough of this. This is a trap that so much of our language about racial justice has, at some point been almost completely captured by, the language and technologies and practices of corporate bureaucracies, of the state managing it, and of this idea that now that Joe Biden has people around him are telling him Black Lives Matter, that this makes some fundamental difference. And I want to say, you have to understand, if there is a backlash, you could understand the backlash being that this is massively disruptive to people's horizons of normative expectations, and it doesn't really offer anything new of where to go. And so part of me, I want to explain why racial justice keeps, running into these, blockages, running into these problems, so that we can, stop investing what I think is, inappropriate model for social change.
Yeah, so this is good. I'm gonna want to hear a little bit more from you. So first of all, the part of the critical work that you do in the piece that's just like extremely valuable is naming this thing, this awareness model, because I think that's exactly it's putting its finger precisely on this like shared premise and confusion that unites a lot of both like obviously liberal and low hanging fruit Earth Day types, but as you say, like, and as Owen has pointed out here, also quite a bit of critical leftist work as well. And, from, Habermas down the line. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. One of them is that you spend some time in the paper talking about our friend Hayek. Fist bumps for Hayek.
I'm so psyched to talk about Hayek.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Owen's chomping at the bit. He's like, "This is where I hope we were going to go."
We're so excited to talk about Hayek. But so you're doing something very interesting with Hayek. One of them is that you are, I think, kind of ribbing our friends in the critical social consciousness model, the lefty types, being like, "Hey, you know who you sound a lot like actually? Is our friend Friedrich Hayek. Is this where you want to land? Because you're sharing a lot of these same presuppositions." So,
is this your boy?
and the reason,
it's a great burn.
Right?
Like,
So,
it sounds like Hayek is your boy. Like it's ruthless.
Sounds like your boy might be Friedrich Hayek. Actually,
a little bit of this you.
is that you? Right. And so and the reason why is because the only difference between the two seems to be something like a generalized pessimism for Hayek and a generalized optimism amongst our consciousness raising friends, right? But they share this idea of self-transparency, of a sort of direct line or automatism from understanding or awareness to transformative practice, and then some sense of the complexity of the structures of society that needs to be understood. And in the case of a Hayek, right, he's like, and it's too complex, you can't understand it, planning is a mistake. Yeah. But in the case of someone I don't know, who thinks that the road to a better society vis-a-vis race is just a matter of getting enough people to understand that racism bad, right? In spite of all of the complexity that involves, right? There's conceptual twins going on here. So could you talk a little bit about this mirroring or patterning and what you see going on there?
Yeah, so basically what I was doing there is that so where Hayek ends up when it comes to things like social justice and change is he is not saying something like don't mess with the social order, you can't do anything. All he's going to what the position he ends up at, because he thinks human cognition actually is dependent on social order. So it's kind of this idea that human cognition for him can never fully grasp the complexity of the order that made it possible. And if that is true, and I wanted to do this because this shows that Hayek's political positions, he didn't just invent them. It comes from an epistemic idea, an epistemic pessimism he has of what consciousness can do. And so all he's going to say is the best we can do is piecemeal reform. And so when I'm looking at the awareness model, all at once, it seems as if this idea that once people are aware, some sort of revolutionary change would happen. But then there's always this explanation of, well, why that didn't happen. And it's, people have these, biases that they don't know about. Or, it's because that maybe they didn't actually become aware. They weren't actually converted.
Go deeper in the subconscious.
Go deeper. And I'm like, how deep you guys trying to go? And what's fascinating is what it caches out as is just piecemeal reform. That, it
Right.
turns out,
Nice.
even though awareness is, going to be the motor, there are also these arguments of why awareness keeps not doing it, but you don't want to let go of awareness. So it's, as I said, it's, these biases that are, distorting awareness, or the person wasn't really converted, or they weren't made aware in the right way. And what I found, shocking here is that sounds a lot like Hayek saying, yeah, consciousness is too constrained and it can't actually, do what it wants to do. And to try to do anything else is disastrous. And so I'm trying to push further and say, well, can an analysis of social order actually better explain the constraints on consciousness, so we don't have to rely on appeals to hidden racism. This is not me denying that there are racists out there, but it doesn't seem to me that's explanatory. After what we saw with George Floyd, we need a better explanation of why the social relations have remained fundamentally the same. And for me, the explanation is there may or may not have been a crisis. And I'm open to talking about, my understanding of the difference between a subjective crisis where, your epistemological and hermeneutical resources, they just start running out to decipher what I'm supposed to do next. Remember, with the George Floyd protests, it wasn't just George Floyd. It was, a once-in-a-generation pandemic. It was an economic meltdown. People who were used to their lives going a certain way all of a sudden found themselves out of work, locked down. And so in a strange way, it actually makes sense that there was this outburst because, people could not make sense of how to, interpret and engage with their practical lives. What wasn't there was, analyses and knowledge of where we go next. And so, I'm worried that, looking at the George Floyd protests, depending on the awareness model, will lead us back to the idea of, well, maybe people didn't become truly aware. And so we need to keep doing more of that rather than, really trying to understand what are the objective constraints and why don't we have the types of institutions that can cultivate, a different type of consciousness that's more forward-looking, that can push us in a different direction.
Yeah, I like the way that you conceptualize that critique of the awareness model. When you basically say that what the awareness model does is that it kind of breaks systemic problems into two orders, right? So you say, look, everybody's talking about systemic racism now. Everyone's aware of systemic racism. Why isn't that, leading to the proposition that maybe we should have a different system, right? I always found that really funny. Right? If you acknowledge this problem to be systemic, you're a revolutionary just by common sense to me. Do you know what I mean? It seems so strange to me to hear Goldman Sachs talking about systemic problems, But
yeah, but I think that says something.
Owen, this is the problem of our time. I feel like we all have to get a grip on what you just said. That everybody says this shit and everybody is just as conservative or liberal as they were.
But it's so strange because it's one logical step away. But I actually think that Will's paper helps to explain how we managed to make this make sense, which is that what you say, Will, is that on the awareness model in a certain way implicitly distinguishes between two orders of system, right? So you have the first order system, which can't be challenged and is obviously just the natural way things are. The market, right? Certain models of state institutions, all that. That's the first order system. And so we can, there can't be any problems with that because that's the way things are. So when we say systematic racism, what we're actually thinking about is the second order system, the things that supervene on the things we can't change. And that, there are some, supervening systemic problems maybe that, overlay the big fundamental system that you can't touch, but maybe we could do something on this supervening level. And then it seems to me that what the concept of crisis consciousness does for you is it allows you to isolate the moment when we become conscious that, oh no, there actually is a problem in the first order system, the things under the really basic systemic aspects of our society that on its own
and basic structure.
Yeah, exactly. And then the utopian consciousness, the third part of it, the utopian consciousness is that, well, maybe we should, maybe it's rational, desirable, and possible to have a different first order system, right?
But that's so difficult. And I want to be very clear for those of you who haven't read the paper, I don't think the way that I put it, there's no necessary political and moral content either to crisis consciousness or utopian consciousness.
I didn't mean to inflate it.
No. I want you to talk about this because it seems extremely important. And you make this point a couple of times in the paper, and it's super important. Yeah, could you unpack that? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so let's stick with crisis consciousness. So sometimes I notice that there is a type of discourse on the left that, loves crisis. That, there's almost this sort of messianic faith that, in crisis, X happens.
100%.
The Messiah comes through, the agent of history emerges, and it's the event.
Yes, the event.
And,
we love events.
love an
folks.
event.
We
love
love
an
an
event.
We
event.
stand an event. We love an event.
But something I've always found a bit sort of morally reprehensible about it is that it's this romanticizing of crisis as if the breakdown of one's normative expectations is actually always a good thing in the end. Furthermore, that subjects want that in the end. Like maybe they don't know it in the moment, but that's the way towards a better world. And I'm thinking, well, in a moment of crisis, what's just as likely to happen are people doubling down on the basic structure or engaging in what we would consider reactionary and reprehensible behavior. Because, on my understanding, people aren't looking for crisis. They're looking to make sense of their world and what they can do to have, as much success as possible in their projects. And so we cannot afford to have this sort of messianic faith that breaking down people's horizons necessarily means some new political subject will come through and, make the world better. With utopian consciousness, that what follows is that I don't think that utopian consciousness, the effort to make a new basic structure, necessarily is going to be better. There is a reason why historically, especially in the 20th century, there was a deep suspicion of utopia, of the idea that you can make a world where people are generally happy, and what you are willing to do to bring that world into being. And so my worry here is that we need to start talking more about what would allow us to guide subjects in that moment of breakdown. And I don't think throwing books at people and telling them that they're guilty and they're racist and all that's going to do it. Because if we understand what people are trying to do, they're constantly trying to reestablish some sense of themselves in the world. And so to push further, I think what's really difficult with racial justice, and this is also my kind of beef with the awareness model, is I do sometimes think, like Owen was saying, that there's an assumption that the basic structure is actually all right, and the problem is at the level of distribution. It's a second order problem, and I don't think that this is because people are being what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think it's because everyone's like, these people are trying to dupe us into keeping things the same. I think actually what it indicates is how difficult it is to establish a new horizon of normative expectations when you don't have a new basic structure in place. And that's what makes my account, I think, materialist. I do not think consciousness can just, jump into a new state of affairs. What I'm saying is you can try to have new horizons, but if there is not a basic structure to ground those expectations, to make them successful, then you're either, powerless and doomed to failure, or you're not actually understanding what the situation is, what the problem is. And so this is me trying to make the argument of this is much harder than I think we imagine, if that makes sense.
I mean, my consciousness can just jump into new things.
Well, yeah, I mean, lucky you.
I frequently take
you're built different.
I've been known to take a great leap forward or two.
Yeah, well, it's the question why you didn't bring us with you.
I like how Gil got that job. He's with me.
Of course.
Oh, great leap forward. That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
To your point, Will, Aaron mentions in the chat that breakdown means a really bad time for already marginalized people, and that the sort of pro-crisis lefty types are the mirror image of the people on the right who are just we just need another great war. Where it's this is there's again a mirroring happening here, which those of us who at least take ourselves to be on the left or progressives should take much more seriously, right?
Yeah.
But so I think that one of the things that your sort of way of talking and thinking about consciousness is so helpful for is this. It's this language that you use, which you've brought up a couple of times now, this horizon of normative expectations, right? And so, what is it that happens first of all in this moment, right? So you distinguish between these two different forms of critical consciousness. In the first moment, there's this sort of crisis consciousness, something like consciousness or awareness, right? Awareness doesn't have no place in your model here. It's just a more subordinate role.
It's insufficient.
It's insufficient, precisely, right? But it does play a role. So it seems like, and you can tell me whether I'm on or off here, right? Something like crisis consciousness is this sort of recognition subjectively or awareness of there being an objective crisis at the level of the structure of society, right? And then it's something like that happens not just because there is an objective crisis in society or that there are structural contradictions, but because something like my ability to orient myself and make sense of myself and my projects and to have a reasonable expectation of the success of my projects, right, falls apart. That there's like that's what like things, where now it's no longer just like it's not a crisis for me, for most people, that structural injustice exists, except for that, right? In certain moments and beyond certain thresholds, this means something for me about how I am not any longer able to make sense, even of like my own self as someone who's got, plans. Like I got shit I want to do. Yeah. Right.
and that's normal. We make plans, and this is what I draw from Hayek. Hayek is saying, well, what you have to understand is that most people can never understand the true sort of complexity of their social order. I think I used the example of how a price is generated. Like I go to the store, bananas are $5 one day.
By the
way, what can I say? I think that this is interesting.
He's a little Hayek.
I go to the store, I see these prices. Yeah. Just a little bit, but maybe I want to say real quick why I'm Hayek pilled. I am Hayek pilled not because I want him to be right. I am Hayek pilled because I think a coherent left must have an answer for Hayek's epistemic pessimism. If it's going to make coherent sense at the end of the day, rather than a priori assuming. And I think I've said this on numerous episodes that sometimes it seems like I'm talking to people and they think, when the revolution happens, we're all just going to know what to do. Like, we're already the types of people who will know what direction to go in, how to deal with, unexpected problems that will arise. And I'm thinking we have to junk this sort of automatic idea that, as soon as the opening occurs, we are going to be able to move forward. And so, what Hayek realizes is if, individuals can't understand completely, all of the complexity that makes up their lives, what they are doing is, they're making bets based on the knowledge that they have. And all of these individual people are making these bets, and I use the language of horizon of normative expectations. And he thinks that this makes sense because consciousness is dependent on this social order. That the social order provides the categories, the frames, and the understanding of what I should do. So I use the example somewhere in the paper that one could understand why a black person, when they reach a certain social class, and maybe they come in ready to turn the system inside out. They're the most radical person. And then you look at them 2 years down the road and they're the ones assigning all this DEI training. They're the ones saying, just hold on, wait. And so you could say they sold out, but I actually think Hayek would have a better explanation, which is they surveyed their environment and they started figuring out what works and what doesn't. And so even if this person is aware and has a type of radical consciousness, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to know how to move forward. And so what I'm talking about here is in a sense what we have to grapple with is that people do not do well with their horizons becoming unmoored. When there's a disintegration, not just of who I am as a person, I think a lot of racial justice rhetoric uses this idea of, white people realizing, oh my God, I'm racist and, I don't know who I am anymore. Okay, it might be that, but it's, about quite literal things of, I don't know where I'm going to, get my next meal, or I don't know how to protect myself from the anarchy of the market and downturns and all of that. And, you are in this abyss. And so what I'm saying is that's a moment of crisis consciousness, and we can look at the George Floyd protests not simply as a moral revolution, but as a moment where there's this broad breakdown for an increasing number of people, more people than there normally are. What there was not was what I'm calling utopian consciousness, which was the effort and the institutions to establish new horizons of normative expectations, new horizons of what this world would have to be like, what different social relations would have to be in place for me to live up to whatever ethics I have when it comes to racism and those types of injustices. The last thing I'll say real quick is this is also partially why I think dealing with climate change is so difficult. What you run up against is this impending sense that the way we're living our lives is not going to remain the same, and yet it can seem like our politics is geared around. But how do we keep the basic structure in place so that your current horizons of normative expectations remain coherent? Yeah, but I think. We have to face up to the fact that exactly, and we have to face up to the fact that it won't. But that is a really hard proposition. You can't just tell people that and then, oh, okay, I guess I'll just become someone new. At least I've not seen that work.
I mean,
so I actually do. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually think that I think Hayek was the perfect person to bring into this argument because, I think you're right that the way that he thinks about things mirrors this kind of implicit epistemic pessimism. I also think more explicitly, he's positioning himself against your view to begin with. That is his project. Yeah. So it's not just that implicitly he's I'm going to be an apologist for capitalism. And what this means is that I'm going to tell you that you can never, know well enough. You can never be a society can't be transparent enough to itself to be able to make economic calculations, except for as individuals kind of problem solve in relationship to the price mechanism. So that's what we need. And there's this epistemic deficit. So if you want to change it, it can never be a wholesale transformation. The point actually is, though, is that that is what he's saying. It's also a position that is explicitly against socialism. That was his argument. Yeah. He actually just wanted, the point of the whole thing is to close off the future for you. It's just kind of saying the same thing you're saying, but through the back door. You kind of came at it through the front door and was listen, this is a kind of implicit epistemic pessimism. This maps onto the awareness model and has the impact of such as this kind of piecemeal reformism and you're never going to know well enough, and that's what we're going to keep working on. We're going to make you know better and better. But through the back door, that's the setup of the whole argument. Is he's just it was the argument with central planning or market socialism or whatever. It's never, it can't be possible. And here's why. So it's almost Hayek is, that's his argument for this is why you need the price mechanism in the specific way that you need it, the ownership of private property and so on. So it's almost the argument is bookended on both sides, which I'm arguing against this utopian consciousness, and then I'm going to make it impossible for you to think about utopian consciousness. And I think that's
he completely forecloses it. Yeah,
he forecloses the future, and so I think that there's a mirroring thing happening with just the end of history. I keep saying, I've said this several times on our podcast, but I think that one of the distinctive things about the end of the neoliberal period is our inability to imagine the future. The fact that we can't think about and all kinds of utopian thinking are literally so abstracted from anything we could actionably do. And that becomes a virtue in and of itself. It's okay, well, if you're not willing to think like that, you're not really a radical. You have to be as utopian as possible, or you're a cynic. And so that, what the kind of result, we're living in the world that Hayek's argumentation has created 100 years later. So that project, that intellectual project was so successful that we don't even know we're trapped in it anymore. And like there's some moments in the past like 5 or 6 years, 2020 or 2016 or 2015 maybe, where you started thinking, wait, can we think about the future again? But then the rapidity with which, I mean, it was blinding. It's blindingly demoralizing if you don't already have a kind of like solid political or ideological foundation. It's horribly demoralizing to start to realize that actually the awareness model, at the end of the day, the fog clears and you're like, that is what's here. Like it's almost like a Wizard of Oz situation where you're just like, you're trying to find the wizard and you think you're about to find him. And then at the end of the day, it's like, that's all it is. I mean, isn't that like, anyway, mind-boggling.
Yeah. We pull back the curtain and it's like just a guy named white supremacy. And we're like, all right, put the curtain back.
Yeah.
Right, like,
but I want to build on that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna. Yeah, you go.
Okay, I was just going to say.
Yeah, go.
This motherfucker, What I was going to say is, for those of you who haven't read the paper, I try to argue that, when it comes to utopian consciousness, that, we shouldn't only cast it out as, only a problem that we can't imagine, a different world. But I actually think that, the social orders that we live under have even fractured our knowledge and learning processes. Maybe you could cast it out in a type of alienation, but, basically what I'm trying to say is that even like what it would mean to start thinking about what it what it looks like to start planning a new order of life, a new social order. Actually, as you were talking, I realized, in many ways, we are so in the grip of the Hayekian neoliberalism that, really focuses on the necessity of spontaneous orders. And, and sometimes it can seem as if, the awareness model is, this, hope that spontaneously a new order will emerge. And, because, Hayek has blocked off this idea of you can never have the type of knowledge you need in order to plan and construct a new life, then all you are left with is this hope of spontaneous outbursts, this hope of a spontaneous revelation and epiphany.
But I have a question here for you, Will.
Yeah.
You've said a couple of times that I don't want this to be a gotcha, but I'm feeling like you're saying something different now than I read in the paper.
Okay.
And maybe you can explain to me where I've not got it. So like you're saying things like, we should ask like what it would even mean to begin doing the work of developing utopian consciousness. And like that perhaps this was part of what was lacking or missing, if we do a retrospective autopsy, right? What happened last year? The largest, continuous, like long stretching protests, specifically in the name of racial justice in history, right? And yet, right? And what do we got to show for it? And part of the suggestion is, well, there was like an absence of utopian consciousness. Mm-hmm. At the same time, in the paper, you point out that, like, in a way, we're actually also living through a utopian renaissance. Mm-hmm. And that, and in fact, utopian consciousness does historically come along with crisis consciousness, that there is some sort of relationship of reciprocal determination or mutual interdependence there. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I've asked my question, but I also want to add to that as like a second thing that you might hopefully be able to respond to is that in the chat, Firebender asked a few minutes ago whether or not we have any examples of organizations or institutions that have displayed utopian consciousness, right? Like what are do we have any sort of like examples of what we're talking about here?
Okay, that's a really good question. Let me start with the first one. So when I say in the paper that we're living through utopian renaissance, what I'm referencing there is that, we are living in a moment where we can call them the structural contradictions or the crises of the social order are increasingly apparent. And, and I mean that like literally with an ongoing pandemic, with, the realization that, Joe Biden being in the presidency, it didn't mean like a new form of life was walking in through the door. And so it makes sense that people in this moment start, grasping and asking, asking, is this enough? But what I'm trying to say is, just people asking that won't be sufficient to bring about something else, to bring about a new social order. It is just as likely that, as Lillian was talking about, people get demoralized and, withdraw or engage in ineffective tactics, or just, think, maybe we just need, one more DEI seminar, one more election, and then we've got it. And this isn't me denying that, reforms are necessary and important, but that was simply me saying that I think that we are living in a moment where, it is possible that the horizons of normative expectations that increasingly more people have are becoming unmoored. And so there might be an opening there if we can generate the types of institutions that can, orient the consciousness to understand what is objectively possible. When it comes to organizations that, that have done this, so this is really hard for me because sometimes I worry I'm a bit too Hegelian because I'm like, but retrospectively, everything seems necessary. And so it can be hard to say something like, oh, things would have gone differently. But I think, if I were to point to some examples, I would point to the civil rights movement in 1960s. I would point to anti-colonial efforts in the 1950s and the 1960s. I don't think it's an argument against saying that there's a type of utopian consciousness there just because everything didn't work out perfectly. In fact, I think what it says is, the gargantuan task that faces us in trying to, reorder and remake the world. And so, if you read Adam Gedachew's World Making After Empire, so many of these, anti-colonial figures thought that they were going to bring in a new international economic order. That was the explicit aim. And, they were trying to make plans and strategies and federations. But, because, the social order is, very intransigent, it's, it's very powerful that, that didn't work out as planned. But I don't think the lesson to take from that, though, is that nothing is possible. I think, that we have been living in a very, difficult time where, after the 1980s into the 1990s, it can seem as if the world we have is simply the world that we're going to have to work with. And I want to ask, what does it take for people to start, investigating the basic structure of their lives and learning what it is that they can do to remodel it so that they can establish new horizons?
I mean, I just don't even know how you can do that if you don't have organizations. I mean, this is complementary to your point, and I think the question, when you think about what it actually takes to learn to have a utopian consciousness, or to learn to see the future, or learn to have shifted normative expectations, I just don't even know what it would mean to do that, if you don't have an organization. And I think the reason that you can say that it's sort of obvious that kind of even if there's an opening for it, certainly, but the reason it hasn't emerged is because it's just not clear people have a place to learn together to do things like that. I mean, when I think it's true that people just rely, how much of 90s and early 2000s philosophy was just about spontaneity in the event and things could be otherwise. I mean, we talk about this all the time, but I just think it's wild that is how people were really thinking. They were something will happen. And I think the reason that doesn't make sense is because we're now, millennials of a certain age who are okay, well, we just keep having all this spontaneity and then nothing happened. I mean, so I think there's just genuine, and even I'll say this, I'm not just talking about the sort of what we used to call anarcho-liberalism that was pretty dominant on the American left from Occupy onward. I also think on the far left and everyone in their little groupuscules, where you think that there's a way in which you can start rationalizing your own ineffectiveness by thinking that you're a part of this movement that through osmosis, it's the consciousness is spreading, Trotskyists or Maoists will often call it the radicalization. It's happening, and every successful act of spontaneity is supposedly transmitting this radicalization, this consciousness to each other. And the truth is, I just have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know how you're I don't know how you're transmitting things. I know that people are going to universities and they're reading what the new left said about their own time and the past. I know that, but like, I don't know exactly how somebody in 2015 who's like campaigning for Corbyn, like, is getting info from the people who participated in Occupy or in the Arab Spring 5 years previously. Like, I genuinely have no idea what you're talking about. And you seem to think it's all just, and I say you, the universal you people, that it's all just like congealing, like it's happening.
Yeah,
I genuinely don't know what you're talking. Like, I get frustrated because I'm like, at some point, I just don't know what you're talking about. These people are not, in fact, communicating all the time.
Yeah.
Like communication has to happen, like, actually.
On your point, Lillian, or your question, because I guess I want to ask a kind of stupid, or maybe it's polemical, or maybe it's both, question about why it is that, like,
It's stupid and polemical.
Yeah.
I live there.
It's not a bad spot, actually.
It's utopia.
Yeah,
It's great.
No, it's the best spot.
but why? Like, so why is it consciousness, especially, that interests you with respect to utopia? Right? There are other ways of looking at utopian social experiments, or utopian institutions, utopian social practices, and I guess my question is why consciousness, and it piggybacks a little bit on what Lillian was saying, because I wonder if, like, you say we live in this interregnum period, right? If we want to put it in the kind of like Sartrean language, we have a certain kind of practico-inert, a certain inertia of practices, a certain practical framework that is disintegrating or showing signs of disintegration, showing signs of like fracture, showing signs that it's not as compelling as it once was. But in Sartre's language, what
It's not. Yeah, it's not as persuasive.
Exactly, it's not as persuasive. Yeah. But in Sartre's, to put it in Sartrean language, it's not that the consciousness is maybe lacking. It's that the group formations are lacking. It's that the practico-inert is breaking down, but the seriality is so deeply entrenched, right? Our serial individuation, our lack of the material framework for connections with one another don't exist. So
that's so good.
So what we have is like an interregnum between a practico-inert that sucks and is shitty and isn't compelling to people, and yet we are still too fractured and individuated to push into a different practical configuration, in which, and like, consciousness isn't antithetical to that. And it's not. That's why it's not really polemical in that sense. Consciousness plays an important role in all of that. But I wonder why it is the aspect of consciousness in that whole process, right, that interests you.
That's really helpful. So, I would want to make clear what I'm saying about utopian consciousness in the paper is, the utopian consciousness that, I am in favor of, that I think would be necessary for social transformation. It's not purely individual. If it were, then I would be kind of hoisting my own petard and think, so we just need people, at least one person start thinking, hey, this kind of sucks. Let's do something else. But, what I am thinking of is, and I believe in that section, I keep using the language of institutions, is how do we make explicit these implicit yearnings and desires and acknowledgments that people have that the usual language, the practical inert is not working, that's falling apart, and how do we organize that and make it explicit so that it can be a type of material force in the world? When you do that, then we're talking about, the emergence of a new form of life. But you can't have a new form of life without a formation, a practical formation. And so my worry is that the awareness model, makes it so that it's just, individuals need to have insight into the fact that the social order sucks. Like, sure, yeah, they do, but that is not enough if that consciousness is, alienated and, torn apart from practical structures that can make effective, this implicit understanding, or now explicit understanding, that the social order is not working. And so, to go back to Gil's question about the utopian renaissance, is I'm not the first person to say this, but I do think that we are seeing that we are in a moment in which neoliberalism no longer completely persuades. It no longer seems, up to the task of convincing people that the horizons of normative expectations, are well-founded by being, invested in this order. The problem is, what other option is there? And that is where I think an opening is, but we can only have that opening for, my argument is if we move away from individuated awareness to practical organizing and structuring, this knowledge to make it something effective. And that will entail, and this is something I always get when talking about utopia, oh, you don't know that there are objective limits. Like, no, people engage in utopian consciousness because there are objective limits, because, things are not working out. They're not like doing it because it turns out everything's gravy. And it's awesome. And so I always think that that's like a holdover from mid-20th century critique that people get from Hannah Arendt, Hayek, and all of that. We need to move beyond that because, what I get from Ernst Bloch is he's saying we cannot only be looking at the past. We need to start actually having knowledge of where we are going.
Yes,
if
ditch
you don't
Arendt
have that,
and Hayek.
Ditch Arendt.
Put
Arendt
this is where it was always going.
Toilet.
That's going to be
going.
what's left of philosophy's lasting contribution is ditch Hannah Arendt.
Drop
Arendt.
Embrace the critique of dialectical reason.
Yeah.
yeah.
Embrace the critique of dialectical reason. Embrace the principle of
Hope, 100%.
And also embrace bringing utopia and knowledge back into relationship with one another, rather than utopia as personal, individual imagination.
Okay, great. So I did want to ask you a little bit more about that. Like both of you touched on these things right at the end of that discussion. So on the one hand, there's this critique that you're developing, which I think has got to be right. And by the way, you said you very nicely before talked about the Spinozist mark that I've left on you by being let's put imagination in the toilet where it belongs, right? But then,
Right,
right,
a little stronger
I am paraphrasing.
I don't know about the toilet, but yeah.
See how these dogmatists be?
I know, man.
This is I think I would call this a generous paraphrase of what you said.
I'm sure you would call it that, yes.
But then correlatively, I can say to you that you've convinced me that part of why we need to keep utopia alive as a principle and one that's got real important role to play is precisely because it can and should be understood not merely as a mode of imagination, but as a mode of cognition. And the language that you use in the paper is that utopian consciousness, properly understood, has an insight, has an insight into not just how I wish things could be otherwise, but about what's something true about the social structure in which we find ourselves. And it seems like you think that Ernst Bloch has something to tell us here about how that works and why we ought to try to understand utopia that way. So can you explain a little bit more?
Two things. One, so people from Habermas to Ruth Levitas, who's a sociologist, to I think Raymond Geist, they've blown Bloch up because they think Bloch can't actually figure out what the difference between ideology and utopia is. That he says that he can, but he can't. So there's the first thing I want to say about what Bloch thinks about utopia is he thinks it's actually a necessary part of reason. He thinks that reason yearns to understand what is not yet. That without utopia, without this investigation of what is not yet, you actually don't have fully formed reason. All you have, for him, it always goes back to Plato. All you have is anamnesis.
That has to be true.
We've been too beholden to this model of reason and knowledge generation. So the first thing I would say, your Spinozist imprint that I am now tossing back to you to convince you is that this is also about reason. This isn't about, irrational spontaneity. This isn't about, going beyond what's taken to be reasonable. The second thing that I get from Bloch that I think is really interesting, this goes into his speculative metaphysics. But for me, the speculative metaphysics is what would I have to be assumed to be true about the world in order for me to even get this project off the ground? And for him, what is the case is not simply what exists, but also latency and potentiality. That for him, it is the capacities that inhere in the objective world of what could be, which prevents utopia from becoming simply ideological of hoping that if I keep jumping in the air one of these times, I'll just randomly float. but it's actually, generating the type of insight that I think can only come through, a type of institutional democratic production of knowledge that will, be able to grasp a social fact, but also grasp, what is latent in social facts. In other words, the way that I think about it is, it's one thing knowing a social fact, which on the awareness model is like, so I know there's institutional racism, what do I do about it? It's another thing learning, so given this social fact, what moves are available to me? What am I able to do now that I know what this condition, this restriction on me is? And I just think that Bloch must be right when he is saying, how can you understand if you think that social transformation is possible if you don't think that the world objectively contains possibility that can be actualized? And he thinks he's following Hegel here in a certain sense of, what's actual is not just what exists, but also possibility. And so for me, reason should not just be acquiescing to mere facticity, mere whatness. Reason should be investigating, the latent possibilities that are constantly, systematically being suppressed or being pushed out of view as if they are not, possible.
That's why I love that you invoke this. Oh, go ahead. No, I just want to say quickly that the concept of Blochian hope, like the Blochian concept of hope that you invoke, you cite him describing the importance of like learning hope. And that not being
educated hope,
right? And that's not a kind of like inwardly directed care of the self or something. That's an outwardly directed way of understanding social conditions in such a way that you don't just reify their facticity, but you are able to see in objective social conditions where the potentialities for alternative vectors of social development lie. Yeah, I just wanted to mark
Lillian,
that.
I know you're going to say something, but I just want to say something real quick for the Spinicists in the audience. Bloch is aware of the Spinicist critique of hope, that is simply the other side of fear. And he says, actually, there are two concepts of hope. Hope that is the opposite of fear, and hope that's the opposite of ignorance. And so this is how he thinks he gets around the idea of hope merely as an affect and hope as a modality of investigation.
I didn't know that.
At some point, we're definitely going to do an episode on Bloch, and we'll be able to get into that with you. But that's what I think he's up to. And that's why it's not just inwardly.
So two things, and then I'm really sorry I have to go because it's 10 o'clock in Berlin and I have yet to eat dinner, and I messed up making my pot roast and I couldn't take it out before we started.
No,
so
I have to go too, but
that's fine. This has been great.
Had a child.
But I just said that
baby
because I don't. You guys should stay and discuss the following things when I go. I'm going to give you homework. A comment, and then a question. A comment is that when you were talking about people, like how can you imagine social transformation if possible, if not A, B, and C? I'm just going to say, like, my judgment is that, like, I think a lot of radicals today don't actually think social transformation is possible. Like, I think that we all, think that we say that kind of stuff, but I think that
That's a really important point.
I think that we live in a time, not only is there outright pessimism, but people's actual behaviors are like dystopian they're not utopian practices, they're dystopian practices. Like what we are doing 100%. Most of the time, like when you feel like you can treat other people like garbage, basically on the internet or anywhere else, or if the only place you interact with people is on the internet, and then you feel like you can treat people like garbage, or you're in political organizations and you feel like you can engage in all kind of nonsense, or you can just be an academic who calls yourself an activist but doesn't actually do anything political. All of these things are what I would think of as like extremely dystopian practices. It means you literally don't think there are any stakes to your behavior. And like likewise, you don't think there are any stakes. Like if you're in a small group of school and you can just have a split and then you can collapse and you can do something else, there's literally no stakes to what you're doing that make you think that's why you think you can do that stuff, because you don't actually think social change is possible, and you implicitly think it doesn't matter what you do. So like, that's the first point. Like, I think that's just like my judgment about like where the left is. A lot of it is at, not all of it. We're not all the, there are things I like more than others, but in general, I feel like that's very pervasive. Second of all, I was just thinking, you're talking about learning processes. I think it's worth asking like whether what kind of idea of progress and teleology is going on in here, because you cited Rahel Yegi, who has been criticized for having, learning can be like implicitly an idea of progress, and this can be problematic. I don't think so. I think that we learn. I think there are normative judgments about learning. Learning, often we think it's good, but
imagine being like, I'm a critical theorist. I think learning is bad.
Right. We think it's good, and we like.
And
we
also
like learning.
remember, my understanding of normative commitments is really thin. It's not just like I ought to do this to be ethical. It's given how I understand the world, this is what I ought to do in order to have success, and that seems.
But success is like normatively inflected. Like you kind of think there's something better or worse about that. But I do think it's like an appropriately circumscribed claim. Like you don't have to say like we're learning ultimately all the time. You can kind of choose when you think we're learning and when we're not. So I just think that's like one of the more obvious set of objections that I know she's received, and like an uncharitable reader, of which I don't think any of us are, could be like, wait, but learning seems to imply progress, and like, are we always learning? And the answer could be no. There could be like regression, clearly. So
I think so.
I'm going to dip out. It was
that.
lovely talking about all of this with you. I'm glad for the people in the chat. I hope it was enjoyable. And I'm just going to say that we are going to have a series on Utopia. So
Can't wait.
That is true.
That is true. And before you go, I just want to announce while you're still here, we are doing our next episode of What is Dialectics, and it's going to be on Sartre's Search for a Method. So look out for that in January.
foreshadowing. Okay, bye guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
I've got a jet too, because just had a baby. It's the official baby of the What's Left of Philosophy podcast.
Official baby.
So I'm still
mascot,
waiting for
if you
Gil
will.
to hook up the little romper merch and the little onesie merch, but
It's
You
true.
know,
Hey,
yeah,
look at
dude.
this. I got my
Hey.
that's what I'm saying. Now you just got to make that in a onesie form, and we're good.
we need. Yeah, I'll put it together in a onesie for you.
But I got to get back to the hospital. So
You got to
Fair
do
enough.
that
Yeah,
bio,
yeah.
and thank you.
love you guys. Thank you, everybody. That was amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you for doing this, and thank you for everyone who came out. I hope it was enjoyable.